Hello, I wanted to do two things in two different lectures. This first one is to outline a bit of background on Reinhold Niebuhr. The second one will be focused specifically on trying to understand his argument and offering fair critiques of it. So these are both trying to give you some sense of doing argument, as well as addressing an important figure whose influence, even if people don't know the name anymore, is important. Um, from the 1930s into the 60s, Reinhold Niebuhr was significant both in theological circles as well as political circles. He had more influence on U.S. politics than any other person in Christian political thought in the United States, and you could say worldwide, by virtue of the fact that what he was arguing for contributed in direct fashion to the containment theory with regard to the rise of the Soviet Union after World War II. He wrote 20 books, published hundreds of essays, spoke at hundreds of public events, and started a number of different groups, religious and political, there. It was often said that he would be in class on Friday with his suitcase by his side to go get on a train and give a lecture. So he was widely read, widely heard, and deeply influential. But I would submit that he's often been understood both by liberal critics like me, as well as those on the right who think he speaks for them. Religious and political liberals then see him as presenting a conservative, if not fundamentalist view in an overall sense, while religious and political conservatives embrace him for that same reason, if you will. Both are mistaken in that sense. This fundamental misunderstanding means that Niebuhr then has been lost as a resource for those who are concerned about peace and justice for today. We've seen some of this dialogue come up a bit. Andrew has mentioned the whole issue of liberal Quakerism. Has it embraced the liberal critique, if you will, related to Niebuhr, that just simply rejects this sort of understanding of the depth of human sin and the problems therewith, the problems of power, and so on, and therefore have missed the conversation just as much as those on the other side who often want to embrace him don't understand his critique that's there of American power and American pride. Now, I think theologically, trying to understand Niebuhr, one has to see that he's approaching things not like I might, right, but lifting up paradox. So for him, the human condition is fraught by the paradox, one, that we understand something, at least on an individual level, about the possibilities of human love. That is, the possibilities to care for one another, even to be self-sacrificing toward that. And again, this is not only in the great scenes of people sacrificing their lives for a great political cause or something, but in parents raising their children and people paying for others to go to school and so on. That's important and that's in there. The same, however, the other aspect that must be held with that is the depth of human sin that will not be eliminated just by more education, sharing money, this kind of thing. This is the problem. And he said you can't resolve that paradox. You can only hold it in faith and live with that paradox in faith this way. He was engaged personally then in living out that paradox. You could see it by his life. So he spoke out of the unchecked capitalism he saw as a pastor in Detroit. He had workers in his house. He saw what the army did and the union busters and so on, and spoke out against that. But he ended up also working for the Ford Foundation. He ran for public office as a socialist, but was a member then also of the Council of Foreign Relations later. He spoke out against the dangers of communism, but had an extensive FBI file because of his support of socialism and his critique of the U.S. government. So both of those together were held. And I think oftentimes people will look at it, well, he just abandoned the one and later, and I think to a certain extent that's fair. But I think he was carrying some of that tension all the way through that you could see. He harshly criticized liberals like me for what he saw as a naive view of the role of power in social relationships, but just as harshly criticized those who sought too much power and so ignored the ideal of human love. He was a forceful spokesman for American democracy, seeing democracy as flawed, but as the best option for people. It wasn't perfect and would never be perfect, but that was the best one. He was Time Magazine Man of the Year in 1948, but at the same time was warning about American pride and materialism. So shortly after World War II, he was already raising these warnings that would be coming to the fore later on. For them. He did not remain, he was a pacifist before World War I, was chair of the Fellowship of Reconciliation and into the early 30s. But as Hitler rose to power, he abandoned the Fellowship of Reconciliation, said it won't stand against what we're seeing these days, and thought he had to resist it. However, before World War II, in his 1932 book, Moral Man and Immoral Society, he was already critiquing pacifism and gave up pacifism, was starting to move away from that completely, but not absolutely. Here he argued that pacifism was sometimes not up to the struggle for justice, and violence for the sake of justice was sometimes contingently required in that. He thought that what pacifists were doing was too much about a liberal ethic that they read into the gospel teaching and the ethics of Jesus, if you will, and not taking seriously human sin. He did acknowledge in that book, already before many people were noticing Gandhi, that Gandhi's nonviolence could help secure justice and so on, to be determined on a case-by-case basis, not as an absolutist kinds of things, but that Gandhi, too, was engaged in a coercive struggle. That is, it wasn't the ideal of love that was being expressed, as many liberals were saying. You have to always, be loving. That's the goal. That's what God is. After all, you have to do that. Now, of course, Gandhi never said that. He said that sedition is my religion, and I've had enough of peaceful petitioning and talking with the government. I want to overthrow it. I want the king to go away, and so on. So he was harder nosed about it, even though refused to engage in physical violence in that way. Niebuhr could be understood then as strengthening the foundation of pacifism by providing a reinterpretation of it. Niebuhr did say that pacifists, when they recognize that they enter social struggles and are seeking power, that if they recognize that and they're not claiming to be morally, religiously superior and pure, then that it could be a powerful tool in securing justice. And furthermore, that nonviolent struggles can often be effective because they're limiting the boundaries of where the nonviolent activists will take that struggle by saying we're going to refuse to kill people and so on. So that might help limit resentment and this kind of thing. So in the break of the pacifism of his day, he did not reject everything about pacifism. So even though people often see him as just this critic of this kind of stance, you can see already, and this is what I hope in looking at argumentation, that there is something in there, even with people with whom you disagree, that can be helpful in your own thinking. You may still end up disagreeing with them, but taking up the challenge of what they're saying can be important in this way. So where did Niebuhr move then? He held the ideal of love in human relations and so on, but focused on the individual level and seeing that, as I said before, that oftentimes we do make that sacrifice that is in some way giving up something of ourselves, not just life and death struggles, but our time, our money, our resources, our emotional energies, and so on. But for him, the problem of sinfulness crept in even there, and more so at the group level. that was his problem that he saw. That is, loving might have an impact on individual level, but on the group level, it's highly problematic. It could have, as he said, in Moral Man and Immoral Society. So his two classic, two-volume theological work, The Nature and Destiny of Man, published in 1941 and 1943 in the midst of World War II, were based on the Gifford lectures he was invited, presented his view, as I said before, the paradox of humanity that's in us, and then offer the eschatological view, his understanding of eschatology of human destiny. Humans could only partially succeed in holding the paradox of our loving and selfish nature in our historical life together. Love is an impossible possibility. It's one of his famous paradoxical statements. However, God's unconditional love, represented by the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ, points us toward our true destiny. The vision of this destiny gives us hope for moving beyond the unbearable tension as we live it now within history, our own history, our social history, the whole history of the past, and so on. Now Niebuhr argued that this vision of the kingdom of God's love was beyond history. We're not going to get it here. It's not coming here. So it's not to be achieved in this world. Our sense of the ideals, then, are important and capture something of the kingdom of God, the final vision, the eschatological solution, but it's beyond history in this way. This kind of view of human fulfillment beyond history has become part of much of the views of religious individuals and groups in the United States. Here's one of the points to say. Here's where Niebuhr has had influence, even if people don't remember him and haven't read him. That is the sense that we get a lot in the culture, is that we're all just caught in a struggle, power struggle here. The resolution is beyond history, and it's because God sent Jesus Christ to die for our sins, that those who believe in him will be saved and taken to the kingdom that will then resolve the paradox. It moves, however, beyond history. Right. So that was Niebuhr's stance then. Again, one that many people moved to, including many pacifists in the interwar years who thought that pacifism now had a chance and so on. And then with the rise of Hitler said, oh, it doesn't work and so on. So that question still remains for us. It's easy to critique, as I did in the Vietnam War, and we'll see Niebuhr did well as well, critique what the U.S. was doing in the Vietnam War, and so on. It makes the case on the one side of well, you know, war's not working and unjust power and these kinds of things. But what do you do in a situation? We're looking at the commemoration of the Rwandan genocide. What would have happened had, as appealed to by UN forces on the ground, the United Nations or the U.S. unilaterally put in a military force to stop that slaughter of 800,000 or 1 million people, right? That's using military force. That's using coercion. That's with people with guns in their hand, telling people with machetes in their hands to not do it or you're going to die. Right. All right. So there's those kinds of questions and so on. Now, Niebuhr, to his credit, and he critiqued it, came then to be used to justify power grabs, to justify what the U.S. was doing post-World War II by planting dictators around the world who were oppressive of their own people, to try to sort of neutralize what the Soviet Union was also doing by trying to establish their satellites in Eastern Europe and around the southern sphere and work out something with China, et cetera, the power plays of the big powers in that way. But Niebuhr was critiquing that, as well as saying power, course of power, sometimes necessary to do that. What the paradox then continued for him, because he kept saying that the assurance of God's love in the next world was a resource for our ongoing struggle for justice in this world. Again, we have to check power with power, but we can only understand the proper use of power by love, by somehow putting those two together. Again, the paradox of sinfulness and loving nature, those are both true of the human condition. You can't separate them apart or say one just subsumes the other in that way. The tension between the vision of the ideal beyond history with our historical life was explored in terms of the United States in Niebuhr's third important work, The Irony of American History, published in 1951. He expressed a long-standing rejection of communism, one as a false religion, and also because it was getting expressed in totalitarianism in that way. There, as I mentioned, he argued that democracy was the best political organization given human nature, but by no means perfect, and by no means would it just work on its own. However, he was also sternly critical of American complacency. So many people, again, that time critique communism, and it still comes up, whoever the next boogeyman is, right? Communism, radical Islam, whatever it is, that process he recognized and says, that keeps happening and you have to check that all the time. But the idea in The Irony of American History was that the United States, he spoke on the U.S., not those out there, was not a victim of history, and therefore is responsible for what it's doing in history. However, the U.S. is also at the same time, paradoxically, not in control of its destiny, so needs humility. And he thought Christianity is the best, could work to hold both of those together, and that's why he thought Christians needed to be educated. That's why he thought was going all over the place, writing all these things, not just for Reinhold Niebuhr, but he thought we, as a democracy here, need to hold those things in tension. You can't be like a liberal and just talk about sloppy love, and you certainly can't be a power-hungry man justifying your oppression of others because you're fighting communism and so on. You become what you're fighting in that way. Niebuhr was holding those two together. Some of the ideals, he went further to say, are similar to communism. He didn't leave his socialist background in that way. So we need to see how we are similar to our enemy in order to avoid justifying will to power. Really important point. Coming back to what I said before. You're going to find in your readings that you're going to find people, just as in the classroom, you're going to find people with whom you disagree. Right? Now, one thing to do is say, well, you're just completely wrong. I have my view. That's it. That's all. End of conversation. Or a benign tolerance. Okay, you have your beliefs, I have mine. Let's let it be. Well, that can work to some degree, but soon enough, you're going to have to face into it. So what Niebuhr was saying then, in this sort of paradoxical stance, is that we can learn from those who are even our enemies. You can learn from then those, like for me, Reinhold Niebuhr, who don't agree with you and challenge your beliefs and theological views. And in wrestling with them, even though you may not come out to the same position, and hopefully not, that wouldn't be very much in terms of good theological thinking, but nonetheless, learn from those with whom you disagree and engage deeply in the debate. Again, as I said in the lecture on arguments, oftentimes what happens is we reactive and then call the other names, whatever it is. You're a liberal, you're a conservative, you're a fundamentalist, you're a communist, whatever, and we think we've made an argument there. All we're doing is protecting ourselves against taking in and relating to those ideas in this way. So some embraced the condemnation of communism then at that point, and as I said, that sort of process continues. Whoever the enemy is, we are on the side of right, and they are the evildoers out there, and so on. But at the same time, people not reading the book carefully missed that he was critiquing as well American self-satisfaction. So finally, in the 1950s and so on into the 60s, you can see this working. Niebuhr supported the U.S. military action in Korea and was quite outspoken in this. He saw, the dangers there. Whatever we make of that, I mean, he spoke out against that. However, at the very same time, Niebuhr supported the decision of the Eisenhower administration to stay out of Vietnam. So early on, he was warning against Vietnam, but at the same time, it seems almost contradictory, saying, okay, we have to take action in Korea. Tragically, we have to do that, but we can't let communism come into the Korean peninsula in that way. He argued then early on that communism not the same everywhere. And the Vietnamese struggle was primarily a nationalistic struggle to get rid of the French occupation. So it was a mistake to step in and try to take over the occupation from the French. In the last decade of his life, then he died in 1971. Niebuhr, though he was struggling with illness, wrote and spoke out against the Vietnam War, arguing that the U.S. had made a serious blunder politically and theologically, and Christians then who supported that war were making the same blunder, but oftentimes that was not seen. For him, the Vietnamese were among the army, the many oppressed people in the world who would rise up against the great colonial powers, right? And the U.S. Risked then being on the wrong side of that development. The struggles that Niebuhr faced in his life and thought are then still with us today. And one might look back and say, here's this person often seen by liberals as being just a supporter of U.S. nationalism and anti-communism, without seeing his strong critique of what the U.S. was done. In a way, some of us would say prophetically, he was warning against what the U.S. was starting to do and the way it was thinking of itself. So he, as an example, can still be an important conversation partner, or at least those ideas with it, because they're still with us, making black and white distinctions and so on, condemning people because they have a whole different view and so on, but also as a model for any of our theological discussion, where in the classroom, online, we're going to find people with whom we disagree, and rather than going up and throwing up things or just letting it go, whatever, we can engage in the conversation to try to sort of see how our theology, how our view of the world, how our vision of Jesus, as with John Dominic Crossan, or our church history with Anna Bass, then might change, even when we disagree with them in that way. So this is the first part. The second one, when you're ready, we will be looking at Reinhold Niebuhr more carefully and trying to raise counter arguments to his position. Thank you. Bye.